Hi guys, welcome back. This is the third video in the series about the standards check and the part three test. So far, we've looked at an overview of the test. We've actually looked at the lesson planning competencies of the test. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the risk management side. And as you will see in a moment, the risk management side is probably the most important set of competencies that you need to be able to perform well in to actually pass either the standards check or in fact the part 3 test. So I'm just about to share the screen so we can actually go through this in a little bit more detail. So if you just bear with me a moment while I do that. There we go, risk management, what the DVSA are looking for on the ADI part 3 standards check test presented by me. So risk management, let's start straight away by looking at what the DVSA guidance to examiners states about risk management. First of all, it says it is vital that all parties in any on-the-road training situation understand and are clear about where the responsibilities lie for the safety of themselves, others in the vehicle, and other road users. And it goes on to say there are two aspects to the management of risk in any training situation. At all times, the PDI, ADI, IU are responsible for their safety, the safety of the pupil and the safety of other road users. In particular circumstances, this can extend to taking physical control of the vehicle to manage a safety critical incident. If you fail in this basic responsibility at any time, you will fail the part 3 or the standards check. So this helps to emphasize its importance. It also goes on from a training point of view. The PDI is also responsible for developing the pupil's awareness and ability to manage risk. As you appreciate, learning to drive and driving is in fact a risk, and therefore you need to help your students recognize what that risk is, evaluate it, and make sure they take that into account in the way in which they behave when they're out there driving. So as the driver, the pupil also has responsibilities, and this is the objective that is being assessed in this section basically. If you think about it, and I've mentioned this before probably in the overview, the register for ADIs was first established about 50 years ago, and it was primarily there to make sure that anybody who was giving driving lessons on public roads was actually safe to do so. And therefore, the number one priority of the DVSA is to make sure that you are safe. And this is one aspect of the job that you must be able to do really well, which is why in the course materials, we push the need for you to be particularly competent in regards to the guardian of safety role. So you can see that that's primarily why we're pushing that to you early, because if you're good in that particular role, then as a consequence of that, the chances are you will pass, even if your teaching or coaching is not as great as it will be, no doubt, in a few years to come. So let's look at where it sits in the 17 competencies. Here's a diagram that we've shown before of the 17 competencies, and the ones in red or pink are the risk management. One is, did you explain to the student how you're going to share responsibility for risk, basically? As part of that, you're also going to talk about whether you're going to take any responsibility for any of the tasks at hand in regards to from a perspective of really a teaching or learning strategy. So that R1 and T1 to some degree slightly tie together, because as well as talking about, well, who's going to be managing the risks and who's going to be taking responsible for each aspect of those risks, you're also maybe going to say, well, who's going to take responsibility for this particular part of the driving task, which may not be specifically to do with risk, but is to do with somehow making the challenge slightly easier for the student, so, or enabling the student to focus on one element of the development of their skills while you take care of the other. So that it's not just about risk. At the same time you talk about risk, you would normally combine it with any aspects to do with who's doing what as far as the actual exercise is concerned. That takes you on to R2, where directions, instructions given in good time and clearly. So this is about quite often the student doesn't know the route that they're going to be taking, and therefore they need you to be able to give them instructions about that in plenty of time. So that's one aspect of the job that you've got to learn, how to give good, well-timed and clearly understood route directions. So that's a basic sub-skill that you do need to learn, and it's tested, or it's marked here under R2. There's also a lot to do with providing instruction on the move. This can be in the form of Q&A, can be in the form of what we call full instruction, where you're telling somebody step by step in great detail what they need to do next, being mindful of the time that you actually have available. So you can't give somebody a long-winded description of what they need to do while you're driving along the road. It has to be pretty to the point and quickly understood by the learner. So it is different to simply describing what somebody should do. It's actually much more like a commentary, which is why at part 2 we get you to do what's called commentary driving, where you first of all describe what you see, then you describe what you're going to do about what you see, and that in a way will actually get you used to the idea or understanding of what you can say and how you can say it within a short time frame as you're driving along. Because as you will discover when you first start doing this, you can't get the words out because you'll probably try to explain it in too complicated a way. So a bit like when we're texting and we have like a shortened version for texting of words, similarly with instruction, there's a shorter version of that. And we have 2 levels. We have full, where we basically direct the student like a puppet on a string to get them to do everything that you want them to do. There's something called partial instruction, which not surprisingly is where you don't give them all the instructions, you leave some out in the hope that they'll do those without you mentioning those aspects. And then we have what we call prompts. And you could say Q&A is a form of prompts because it can be used in that way as well. But you use prompts to actually aid the student, so that you wait to see, are they going to do it? If you think they're not going to do it, then you slip in a little prompt just to remind them. And so that's another level of instruction. All these different things are called, when you're using them to direct the learning, it's really part of level of instruction, which is one of the old competencies. In fact, I'll bring those up just to remind everybody what those are. So level of instruction is down here, one of the instructional techniques that we talked about. As you will also see as we go through, the identification of faults, or see it and say it, the fault analysis, i.e. suss it, and the remedial action, sort it, you'll see will all exist or very much get launched by the risk management competencies. The planning obviously relates to the planning. Control of the lesson is also here, because the way in which you provide instruction to the students in R2 will in fact help to control the lesson. It's about communication, because obviously your instructions have to be clear and understood. As we've said, it's about Q&A technique, but Q&A technique, or use of questions, can be used both for teaching and assessment, as you will discover, and for many other purposes as well. Instructions could take the form of feedback and encouragement. You know, you could see that your student needs a little reassurance, so they don't really need telling what to do, but you can see they're looking a little uncertain, but you know they're going to do the right thing, so you just reassure them that what they're doing is correct. So that would come under feedback and encouragement. So that's, if you like, the the R2, which is directions and instructions. And that also closely links to T1, because an instruction is a style of teaching, and therefore it forms part of T1 as well. We then move on to R3, which is being aware of your surroundings and the actions of the pupil. Obviously, if you're going to detect where you need to be focusing your efforts, either from a learning point of view or in terms from a risk management point of view, you need to know what's going on. You need to be aware of what your students doing, and you need to be aware of what your students ideally feeling, which will be shown through their body language. And you also need to be aware of the situation that's occurring around you, so that you can actually anticipate what difficulties may occur, or what needs to happen, and what you should now be expecting your student to do. So if you can see a hazard ahead, you would expect to see your student, first of all, potentially look in the mirror just to be aware of what's around them. You'd expect them possibly to change speed or direction, maybe potentially give a signal. So you're not going to be aware that these things should be happening if you're not aware of what's happening immediately in front of you, but also around you, to your sides, and in fact behind, which is why you also have a mirror. So R3 is very much about being aware, knowing where to look and when, basically. So that's actually the first skill or competence you need if you're going to identify not only areas where development opportunities or learning opportunities exist to help improve the student's performance, but also in the case of the old core competencies, is when actual driving faults occur as a consequence of the student's actions, or indeed generally of any safety critical fault, which may not necessarily be a result of the student's actions, but may be something that you're going to have to deal with to make sure that it doesn't cause you or your student, or in fact any of the road users, any problems. So R3, aware of your surroundings, is effectively identification of faults, of driving faults, as in the old core competencies. It's also about, which then leads you naturally on to the next one, which is the fault analysis, or the next thing in the seed. So we've said identification of faults. R3 is like seed, where R4 is basically the say it. Was any verbal or physical intervention by the trainer timely and appropriate? So this is the seed, R3, and now you're doing the say it, which is R4, which is trying to prevent faults if you can, on the basis that prevention is better than cure. So you're always on the lookout for situations where you may have to verbally intervene, or if that doesn't work, ultimately physically intervene, which all depends on the time you have available, which we'll talk about when we look at each of these particular competencies in a little bit more detail. So you can see we've covered quite a few of the competence instructional techniques, and at least the identification of faults. The final one is, was sufficient feedback given? Well, to get sufficient feedback, you have to understand what's happened. So this is really where in the old core competencies, it would be the fault analysis. If it's to do with teaching, it's where you analyze where learning opportunities exist, or where your understanding of the student's performance, how does the student's performance match to A, what the student expected, and B, what in terms of how close are we getting to the level of ability that we wish to see at this stage. So that's the, if you like, the fault analysis. So you can see again, it's both to do with risk, but it's also partly to do with where are they at as far as a learning perspective is concerned. So that then, as you probably realize, leads on to remedial action. So now you've given the feedback, you now need to have the conversation about, well, how we're going to sort that out, what we're going to do, what we're going to do differently next time to this time, basically, which is where you go back to that lesson planning one of adapting the lesson plan, which, if you like, is the remedial action step combined with L1, L2, and L3, ready for the next particular learning exercise that you're going to address, or activity that you're going to start. So that gives you a quick intro to each of the risk management competencies in turn, enough to give you a quick overview. What we're going to do now is actually look at them each in a little bit more detail, starting with R1. Did the learner ensure the pupil fully understood how responsibility for risk would be shared? So what does this involve? Well, initially, in some detail, you're going to have to explain who's going to do what, the fact that you are ultimately responsible for safety, and that they need to, if you ask them to do something, you need them to basically go do what you want, and you'll explain to them. If they're not sure why you're asking them to do it, you'll explain why later on. And you'll also talk about how, if you decide to grab on the steering wheel, or if you're going to use the dual controls, or if you're going to make use of any of the controls that are within your reach, you will let the student ask the student not to wrestle with you if you're doing the steering, not to stop you touching the controls that are easily within your reach, and with the reassurance that you will talk to them. And it's all simply because it's all about trying to keep them safe. And to be perfectly honest, if there's a dangerous or risky situation going to happen, the pupil will be more than happy for you to intervene in some way, because it would be, more often than not, it would be pretty obvious to them that there's a serious, not always, but more often than not, it will be relevant to them. And if not, you're reassuring them that, let me take some action, let me intervene, and then we can talk about it later. And what you will do, you obviously discuss this in some detail when you first meet for the very first lesson, but then you will occasionally remind them that, and it might be as simple as saying, don't worry, as usual, I've got your back. If anything happens, I'll step in. I'll let you try to deal with it yourself, but if I can see that it's becoming an issue, then, you know, I will step in, and then we can talk about it afterwards. You know, there's no big deal about it, because, you know, nobody gets anything right first time, so there's nothing to be concerned about. It's just I will make sure that you will remain safe, basically, no matter what. And that will help put the student at ease, because they need to feel that they are in a risk-free environment. The more uncertain they feel, or the more fear they feel, the more less likely they are to be able to learn very effectively. So that's why this is important. First of all, to say it initially, and then to occasionally remind them, so that they can feel reassured that you're not going to let anything dangerous happen to them. You're going to step in before that becomes a serious issue. The sharing of responsibility and the discussion of risk actually forms part of setting the SMART goal in the first place, in the challenge. There's no point in, one of the reasons why the goal's got to be realistic and sensible or attainable is because if the step's too large, then the challenge is too great, then there's much more risk associated with it, because we're driving in a safety critical environment. So anything that means that the student's not going to be knowing what they're doing is going to enhance risk. So this is why it's actually even part of L1 and L4 effectively. Whether you're adapting the lesson, whether it's the very start of the lesson, it's the very first goal you're setting, or whether it's actually a subsequent adaptation, you need to consider risk as part of that that initial goal or that adaptation. It also forms part of any planned activity, which is effectively the L2 and the L3 that we talked about, to make sure the pupil knows who's doing what in respect to provide an agreed level of instruction. So if between you've decided that there is some level of instruction or some other support or aspect of what the student's doing is going to be your responsibility, then that needs to be made clear before you actually embark upon the next exercise or driving activity. And where it comes into, as I said, is to, first of all, what to expect in regards to help and support to deal with any specific known hazards they are likely to encounter, which are potentially outside the pupil's comfort zone. Managing risk, which is also part of R2 and R4 in a way, but it's at this stage, this is what you're thinking about. If you know the activity is going to contain some known risks that are likely to be outside of the student's comfort or competence zone, then this is the time to talk about it before you start the activity, and actually have some sort of strategy plan in place from a risk management point of view to deal with it, which does in fact potentially take us on to R2 and R3, as you'll see in a minute, which is what structural support you're going to provide and or what interventional support are you going to provide. And as we mentioned, it can also be used as from a teaching perspective, in that it can help you transfer responsibility, because by the level of support, by what you're doing, whether you're actually partly taking responsibility for some part of the activity, or whether you're actually going to give them some instructional support, will effectively increase or decrease the challenge. It's another way of actually increasing or decreasing the challenge. Obviously, you could simply make the activity simpler or less difficult to perform. In other words, get them to perform a less difficult activity, which doesn't require any support from you. That would be one option, but that's not always possible because you're actually limited to where you can do things. So quite often, you'll have no choice but to say, well, we're going to do this, however, it's not ideal and what I would like, so I'm going to help you out in this particular activity, and this is where I'm going to help you out. And that's simply to make sure that the challenge is more sensible for the student at this stage of their ability. Similarly, it can also involve directional support, because you have to decide, am I going to give you directions on this route, or am I going to let you drive independently, knowing the route to actually follow? Another way of actually increasing the challenge. So that's sharing responsibility, R1. This is what the DVSA guidance to examiners says about this particular competency and what represents good practice. So indications of having competence in this regard could include asking the pupil what is meant by risk, asking the pupil what sorts of issues create risk, such as the use of alcohol or drugs, explaining clearly what is expected of the pupil and what the pupil can reasonably expect of you, checking what the pupil understands, what is required of them, where there is a change of plan or they're asked to repeat an exercise. So any of those things, according to the DVSA, would suggest that you have a certain level of competence in this area. It then goes on to say, specifically to do with this, in the guidance to examiners, the balance of responsibility between the pupil and the ADI will inevitably vary in different circumstances. However, opening statements are not all that is involved in meeting this criteria. In other words, on the previous slide, I mentioned that you had this big discussion initially on the first lesson what they're trying to re-emphasize here is that when you do your standards check or part 3, they do not expect these gigantic opening statements about risk management and criterion and who's going to do what. And the ADI should be managing the process throughout the lesson. So you can see this sharing of responsibility is actually going on all the time. It's not actually something that just happens once at the start of a driving lesson. So what do they consider as bad practice? Well, failing to address the issue of risk management altogether. In other words, you've not even talked about whether there's any risk involved in this activity that we're about to embark upon. Would indicate that you're not fulfilling this role, but you're not actually dealing with this competency very well. Or giving incorrect guidance by where responsibility lies for risk management, would be another example. Failing to explain how dual controls will be used. Well, this doesn't mean on every lesson you have to explain how dual controls are used, because obviously you would have used those. But if you would actually use the dual controls and then hadn't explained it, or hadn't even explained that there's a possibility that you might have to use the dual controls when it was pretty obvious to you that this might be something that you would have to do in this circumstance, then that's where failing to explain dual controls will be used. Undermining the pupil's commitment to being safe and responsible by agreeing to risky attitudes, to alcohol use, or indeed any risky attitudes, any aspect or any encouragement to be unsafe, if you like, or downgrading how important it is to drive in a particular safe manner, would in fact be undermining the pupil's commitment to being safe, because you're not leading by example. Asking a pupil to repeat a maneuver or carry out a particular exercise without making sure that they understand what role you are playing. So if you actually start intervening or doing things or taking control of certain aspects of the activity without actually having explained that you were going to do that in the first place, would again show that you're not performing this particular competency in the way that you should be. So now if we look at from an LDC point of view and how we would ask you to rate your own performance in your lesson reflections, this is the question. You can ask yourself the general question: did you pupil fully understand how responsibility for risk will be shared? But in more detail, this is what we would ask you to look at and consider for yourself. Did you make sure the learner was aware or reminded of your overriding responsibility for safety and how they should behave if you deem it necessary to intervene, either verbally or physically? So, as we said, if it was the very first lesson, it was very first exercise, which it will not be on a standards check or a part 3, then you would make them aware, as we said, in some detail. But then occasionally you may just remind them that you've, if you like, got their back, or you not to worry. When would you do that? Well, you'd do that because you'd look at your student's face, and if they look particularly concerned or worried before they wanted to do something, then you could give them that reassurance, which is explaining how responsibility potentially would be shared. Make sure the learner was aware of any particular risky elements in any proposed goal or action plan, and was it clear who would be responsible for what beforehand? So if you know beforehand that there are some aspects that are highly likely to be outside of their comfort zone, you may not be able to avoid them. Therefore, it just doesn't make practical sense to try to work around them. Then you need to have a discussion about it beforehand and decide what you're going to do. It could be that the route that you've picked just has a very, very difficult, really complicated junction, one little junction out of maybe 10 junctions that might cause an issue. And that junction, you would probably say, well, let's talk about that. You see how your student responds, whether they would be happy for you to talk, what we call talk them through that particular junction, to make sure that they, did what they needed to do to actually get past that particularly risky aspect. Or the strategy more likely would be to try to pull up before you got to that junction, check with the student at that time and say, what shall we do? We can simply switch seats and I can drive us through that junction, and then we can carry on, and you can switch back again, and then we can carry on from there. Or are you still happy for me to help you through that junction and give you a lot more verbal support and or physical support if necessary than I would normally do? And so that's really what that means, aware of a particular risky element. Encourage, and having some strategies to deal with it, an action plan. Encourage, make sure the learner was encouraged to recognize what might constitute a risk on any proposed action plan or goal for themselves. So it's no good you just say, well, this is a bit risky. You need them to recognize the risk, and the only way to do that normally would be using Q&A or questions. You can explain it, and that might be sufficient for the student to understand, but normally questions are usually, where do you think the risk might be in this particular exercise, or what do you think we particularly might need to look out for, or when we're actually emerging from this junction, or whatever the case may be, so that you can engage the students. And if they can't figure out what the risk is, then you'll help them and give them a bit more of a prompt. You might explain it, you might give them a bit more information, make them more aware, so they have a better understanding, so they better understand what you understand, so they can actually start to assess this risk for themselves, because ultimately, obviously, they're going to be driving independently and they're going to have to make decisions about risk. So the sooner you can start them looking at this and thinking about this as part of any driving task that you get them involved with, the better, really. Did you make sure the learner was clear what instructional support or directions, if any, you would be providing in the next attempt of any particular driving task? So this is, again, making sure that they know, am I directing myself, or are you giving me route directions? Am I going to try to do this completely unaided, unassisted? Is that the plan for this particular attempt? Doesn't mean you might still not step in, because you might have to step in, as you'll see later, when we actually look at the R2, R4, and the T1. But that's that at this point, this is what you're saying at this point. So this sharing response is really setting out the plan, really, for R2, R4 in particular. And encouraged to express, did you make sure that it was encouraged to express their views or opinions about what contributes to any risky behavior seen or stated in any example given by you? So this is in situ, while you're doing things, while you're seeing things. Are you encouraging the student to express their views and opinions? Do be careful here, otherwise you could actually fall into the teaching in terms of about discrimination or being professional. So do be careful at this point. When you do involve these, you need to be mindful that you're not going to make situations worse by calling people idiots or stupid or whatever for their behavior. That doesn't really help in this situation. You need to be quite matter of fact and neutral in dealing with these. And as a lot of instructors say, is just imagine that that's a good driver on a bad day. So that's the way to get around that. So to deal with, with a view to develop a strategy for dealing with such behaviour going forward, which would in fact be R5 when we talk about sussing things out, feedback, and R4 would be adapting the lesson. So you can start to see now how everything really, a lot of things are actually interconnected and interlinked. So this is how you would actually, if you ask yourself these questions, you know, nobody's perfect. So if you can actually, if you could positively answer every one of those questions and be 100% sure that that's what you did, then that's marvelous. Then you're achieving this competency to way above what the DVSA necessarily expected. So we obviously, as trainers, have to express, if you like, the optimum skill that would show that you can perform this competency. But you don't need to be as brilliant. Well, you can, that's probably obvious from what the DVSA say about it. So we also, as you know from previous videos, as well as actually looking at it from an assessment perspective, we've also tried to express it as a skills target. What am I trying to do? What ability am I trying to develop? Well, basically, you're trying to develop your ability to explain what the learner can expect of you, the way you can assist them using verbal and or physical intervention and or by agreeing risk management strategies in advance, and what you require of them to keep everybody safe. Initially at the start of the course in some detail, and then occasionally to remind them from time to time as may be necessary to provide reassurance or in respect to who is responsible for what before you initially set a learning goal or embark upon a specific learning activity, but especially if it's necessary to adapt the plan L4, then that's highly likely that you're going to need to discuss that. And in respect to what level of help you intend to provide, in what form and when, as part of a transfer of responsibility or as a way to decrease or increase the task difficulty of the challenge. So it's either part of a plan to provide support, which will then be gradually reduced, or it's to increase or decrease the task in some way, as part of a teaching strategy, which is connected, as you'll see in a moment, both to R2 and T1. So that takes us nicely onto the next skill, which is directions and instructions. Were directions and instructions given to the pupil clear and in good time? So were directions, as I said, given in clear and good time, and it follows on from what directional and instructional support was agreed as part of any plan. So this is where it ties back to L4, adapting the plan, L1, setting the goal, R2, the activities, R3, the route, and R1, which is where you've just agreed some sort of way to share responsibility for risk. So it's also any instructional support designed to transfer responsibility as a teaching strategy. So this instructional support that you provided, or what we used to call level of instruction, could be designed to transfer responsibility as a teaching strategy. Normally, if you were doing that, you would start off by giving somebody a lot of support, full instruction, partial instruction, prompts, Q&A, and then ultimately leading to unassisted. So this is how it's used if it's a teaching strategy, which is worth mentioning here, even though you could say, well, that's not specifically to do with risk. Well, in a way, it does to do with risk, particularly if you're dealing with a safety critical fault, because by implanting instructional support on the next attempt, where the student may commit the same fault again, what you're doing is you're basically making sure that a fault doesn't happen. But obviously, there's no good in carrying on doing something where to stop the fault happening, you have to mention it every time. So initially, you might help them with it, but then eventually the idea is to get it so that it's unassisted and it's therefore sorted. So especially if it, as I say, it's safety critical occur. Any instructional support to deal with a potential risk management intervention strategy, which is more to do with R4, as we'll see in a moment. In this case, it's where there's either known risks or things where you know you're going to have to get involved, or unexpected hazards occur, which weren't particularly part of weren't expected, but nevertheless, it's now happening, and you've got to decide, is the student up to dealing with it? And one of the ways you can find out is, first of all, ask them if they even are aware of what's happening. You know, that might be sufficient, and depending on how they respond, you might think, yeah, I think they're going to be able to deal with it. Or you might think, no, they're not. Then you might give them prompt. And if they're still not sure, you might say, well, slow down. You might go, you need to slow down. So you might even raise your voice, because they're not seem to be listening to what you're saying. And then if worse comes to worse, then physically you might have to intervene using dual controls. But we'll look at that more when we look at R4. You might opportunistically make use of instructional support in its various forms, i.e. Q&A, commentary, or explanations, to enhance understanding of risk management issues. But they need to be clearly welcomed and beneficial to the pupil. Otherwise, as we'll see, then they may be considered as over-instruction. And as it says here, being careful to avoid under or over-instruction. So under-instruction is where the student would have obviously benefited from some support or help from you, but you just didn't give it, which then led to other difficulties arising. Or over-instruction is where the student's becoming almost frustrated with you, because he's thinking, when am I going to get to do this for myself? Because you keep sticking your oar in all the time, and you're not giving me a chance to show that I can actually do this for myself. So that's basically the difference between over-instruction. It's one of the reasons why the examiners, when they do a Part 3 on a standards check, find out whether you're a beginner, which is B, partly trained, PT, or trained, or full license holder new, or full license holder experienced. That's why they ask you how many hours of training have they had, or whether they are already a license holder or not. And in fact, they would expect you to tell them whether they're a full license holder or not in any case. You don't need to worry about beginner, because beginner is now not really, you're not really, you're discouraged, shall we say, extremely discouraged to bring a beginner to either a Part 3 or a standards check. So your options really are to bring somebody that's partly trained, i.e. usually 10 hours and above, a trained person, possibly 20 hours and above. Full license holder, obviously somebody that's passed the test. New means that they are a full license holder, but they're not that experienced. And or you've got a full license holder that is experienced, has been doing it for a lot of time, and therefore, you know, you need to look at that in a different way. Because again, you know, you can't try to treat them like a beginner. That won't work. Full license holder wouldn't be very pleased any road if you tried to treat them like they knew nothing. If you like, think Goldilocks. It's, you know, it's not going to be too hot, too cold. It's got to be just right. And this equally applies to R4 when we look at intervention later on. So what do the DVSA say about directions and instructions? Were the directions and instructions given to the pupil clear and in good time? Indication of having competence in this regard could include clear, concise directions, not ambiguous, understanding ensuring the pupils understands what the plan to do and agrees with that plan. So it's not good enough just to make sure they know that you've explained what the plan is. They have to agree to that plan as well. That's where the client-centered bit particularly comes into being, more so now than with the older core competencies. Directions given at a suitable time so that the pupil can respond. So again, this depends on the experience of the pupil and where they're at. You know, if you're going to give route directions, make sure they're given in a time which enables the pupil to respond and doesn't distract them or create an issue for them in terms of their personal performance in dealing with whatever it is that they're about to deal with. And it also goes on to say, any input, in other words, anything you input to the situation must be sufficient, timely, and appropriate. It's important that you take account of the ability of your pupils when giving directions or instructions. Directions, instructions given late or in a confusing or misleading way do not allow the pupil to respond and can make weaknesses worse. So you can actually create your own set of driving faults if you don't do this very well. And it also then goes on to say too many unnecessary instructions from you can both demotivate the pupil and create a real hazard, as we've already intimated. Remember, it is an offence to use a mobile phone whilst driving because it's known to create a level of risk equivalent to, or in some cases greater than, driving whilst drunk. You will be surprised how many driving instructors you'll see going along the road thinking that while they're in charge of that vehicle, of that lesson, can actually mess around with a phone. Don't do it. It's not allowed. It's legal. You will lose if you get caught by the police, you will actually lose your license, or you will actually lose your registration if you get caught doing that. So don't do it. It cannot therefore be good practice to consistently bombard the pupil with unnecessary questions. So obviously a lot of people say you must use lots of questions, and as a consequence, PDIs when they go, or indeed even potentially ADIs when they go for the standard check, end up going mad with questions. And as all that's doing is overloading the student and causing them to make more mistakes. So be careful that you don't, questions are useful, but overuse of questions, it's like almost anything, whether it be instruction, whether it be questions, whether it be coach, overuse of anything is usually not good, and there's usually a balance to be gained that will actually work well and match what your pupil needs. So what is lack of competence as far as the DVSA saying, the guidance to examiners? Well, giving directions or instructions too late, fairly obvious. Giving unnecessary directions or instructions, we talked about. Failing to recognise where the PDI's input is causing overload or confusion. So this is why you need to be aware, which goes back, which in fact goes on to R2, in fact, of what the student is feeling, which we'll look at later in R3. So if we now look at it in terms of how are you going to assess your performance while you're out practicing giving lessons for free, or you're on a trainee license and you're looking to evaluate your performance in regards to this competence, these are the questions that you need to ask yourself. Did you only give necessary, timely, and clear instructions or directions? Did you allow the learner to concentrate and focus on the learning task at hand without being affected by unnecessary or confusing instructions or directions? When a student is practicing or developing a skill, they need to be able to focus on that particular process. They need to be able to, otherwise, if they're always waiting to hear things from you, then that's not going to help their development. Did you give the learner every opportunity to be able to drive independently? So the more independence you can give them, the more they don't need your support, which obviously is one of the reasons why you need to be clever with the tasks and the challenges that you set. The more they will develop a sense of responsibility, avoiding over instruction, but so it does avoid over instruction, but not at the expense of allowing unnecessary risky situations to arise. Prevention is better than cure. So if in doubt, and you instinctively feel, I don't think the student's going to tackle this or deal with this appropriately, then do it. Actually get involved, and if you like, take the risk of being accused of over instruction. It's better to be safe than sorry. And the DVSA do see prevention as better than cure. So even though from a coaching perspective, you might say, oh, let the problem arise and then we can learn from it. There are some problems that are best not been left to develop. You know, it's better if you actually intercede and then talk about it later. If the student's unhappy that you intervened and it wasn't necessary, just apologize. Say, well, I'm sorry, I wasn't sure that you were going to deal with it. So please accept my apology. I'll be more considerate next time and make sure I give you the opportunity to deal with it yourself, if I can. Did you ensure the pupil wasn't demotivated by unnecessary or confusing instructions, commands, prompts, or questions, or too little instruction when some support would have been clearly helped? As you can see, it really is direction instructions is really all about this Goldilocks moment. It's getting the balance right for the student in front of you and the task that you've set. If the task is potentially really pushing the student right to the edge, then some instruction, some intervention may well be necessary. Obviously, if you could set up situations where you could be certain that the task or the challenge could be satisfied by the student with just a small step up from where they are now, then all well and good. But that, in reality, that's not always possible. If you could design your own training route with your own roads and your own roundabouts and your own things, then you would have a better chance of being able to do it without the need to actually come in with intervention and support in this way. And did you ensure the learner was given sufficient time to respond to instructions, whether full instructions, partial prompts, and or Q&A? So they're the questions you need to ask yourself. Again, as I said before, if you're doing those 100%, then amazing. Give yourself a free, give yourself a free plus if you like. The DVSA are not expecting you to be perfect in this regard, but it is one of the critical skills that they expect. All these risk management skills are particular skills. So if you want to focus on any skills, these are the ones that you must really focus on doing well. So in terms of looking at this, expressing this in another way as an ability that you need to develop, you need to develop your ability to make sure the learner always knows where they are going, what they are doing, and especially in regards to any plan related to the management of risk, ensuring that any questions, advice, instructions, partial or full, prompts, explanations, or directions are clear, timely, and understood. And if they're not, because nobody's perfect. Nobody's going to get this 100% right all the time, as we said. But then to recognize that and quickly modify accordingly if they are not, which is also closely tied to T1. If you look at what T1 is, you'll see why. So let's look at awareness, R3. This is the first, if you like, the one that clearly links directly to the core competencies of fault identification, fault analysis, and remedial action. And this is R3 is the awareness, which is really to see it. So, as I said, it's clearly connected to fault identification, and it's the see it bit of fault identification. So, you need to be aware of known hazards, or those hazards you might reasonably expect in this location at this time of day, which are likely to be outside of your pupil's comfort zone, as demonstrated by an appropriate agreed risk management intervention strategy being in place, i.e. R1, an appropriate level of intervention support taking place, Q&A, prompts, full, partial, full, and physical using dual controls, if necessary. On a prevention is better than cure, which is really to do with R4, which we'll talk about shortly. So you can see, to be able to do this, you do need to know your area extremely well. You do need to appreciate the ability of your pupil at this stage, and you do need to know what you get them to face, which is why often, because it's a route that you're dealing with, you need to know the area, you need to know each junction, you need to know the level of difficulty that each element within that route particularly presents to your learner for the level at which they are at this moment, which of course is you could say is also closely linked with L2 and L3, and indeed L1. So are you aware of the pupil's actions and demeanor? Demeanor meaning primarily their body language, noting opportunities for further improvement in their performance or well-being, as shown when you discuss these aspects with a pupil at the next reflection or review. So proof, if you like, of you being aware of the pupil's actions and demeanor in terms of their, learning performance and emotional state. In other words, what they're feeling like is demonstrated by what you talk about as part of the reflection or review. You see, you might say it straight away, as we'll talk on when we go on to R4 in a moment, which will also demonstrate that you actually are aware of these things. And are you aware of the pupil's actions, particularly if it's resulting in any safety critical driving fault, i.e. any potential driving fault that would be marked as serious or dangerous occurring or being prevented? So whether it actually happened or whether you prevented it, you need to see it. And as we'll see in a moment, you will need to communicate, as proven by the fact that you communicate it as soon as it is safe to do so to the pupil. So the examiner won't actually know whether you are aware of these things necessarily, although sometimes it might be blatantly obvious to them. It's more a case of what you do with what you see. And the fact that if you don't do anything with what he sees and what you should have seen, that will tell him that you weren't aware. You didn't see it in the first place. Or that's the conclusion he will draw. Either you didn't see it or you've chosen to ignore it. Either is not good. So let's have a look at what the DVSA guidance to examiners says is good practice in respect to awareness of your surroundings and your pupil's actions. First of all, you take in the outside world. So it looks like you are paying attention to the outside world and you're not looking at your phone or looking at your feet or you're spending too much time focusing on your clipboard. You actually look like you're actually taking in your surroundings and you're aware. So you're looking alert, you look like you're scanning your surroundings. Be able to observe the actions of the pupil, including comments and body language. So that's what we said. So if they say something or if they reflect something in their body language, this is relevant to being aware of your surroundings. You've got to be sensitive to this because this could then change, the R2, the level of instruction that you're giving. Judge whether those actions are suitable in any given situation. Respond accordingly, which really comes on to the next stage or may require you to intervene fairly quickly, which will take you straight into R4. So this question lies at the heart of what you as the heart of a PDI's or ADI's professional skill. In most situations, a PDI, ADI will maintain their awareness of what is going on around them, given reasonably clear and timely directions, and intervene in an appropriate and timely way to ensure that no safety critical incidents occur. However, from time to time, situations will arise in which an ADI, PDI's actions or instructions are of such poor quality that the examiner may decide that they are putting themselves, the learner, or any third party in immediate danger. In these circumstances, the examiner would be entitled to stop the lesson and mark it as an immediate fail. Something we mentioned in the initial overview to the part 3 and the standards check. Bad practice. Be unaware of the situation as such as change of speed limits, etc., or other important information. Being unaware of the pupil's actions. So was the trainer aware of the surroundings and the pupil's actions, indications of lack of competence in this regard, being unaware of the situation ahead, such as change of speed limits, etc. Being unaware of pupil's actions, and any serious lapse in this area are likely to lead to a 0 marking. So if the previous statement, where it said you could immediately fail, and didn't get home to you how important this ability is, this is the one key ability as a driving instructor that you must absolutely have. Hopefully the fact that you could end up with a 0 here will actually help to remind you, and if you remember from the overview, the subsequent knock-on effect that would have. So if we look at it from how will you assess your performance, whether you're teaching for free or whether you're on a trainee license using our lesson reflection form that you'll find in your student's logbook. Were you aware of the circumstances around you and how your learner was feeling? So it's the actions and the feelings of the student that you need to be aware of. The learner's ability to deal with those circumstances. So this is being aware of what capability your student is at, you know, how confident are they, you know, is it something they can deal with? So you've got to be able to have to anticipate. You've got to be able to match. So you're going to have to know what your student's capability is at any point in time. You've got to be aware of your own body language as well as that the learners. Why do you need to be aware of your own body language? Because your body language is communicating things to your learner. Because just like you're aware of your learner's body language, they will probably be aware of your body language. So do be careful how you express yourself through your body language, because that will actually cloud the issue potentially for your learner. And what they might, you need to be aware of what the learner might do next, which comes partly with experience. So it's not something you necessarily be necessarily that good at to begin with. The driving faults made by the learner or those that could have been reasonably prevented with some support from you, particularly those of a safety critical nature. So if several safety critical situations arose and you didn't, you weren't able to stop them in the first place, then you need to ask yourself the question, were there any telltale signs? If there was, why didn't you intervene then? Why did you leave it till it actually happened? And did you actively listen to your learner's verbal and non-verbal communication, i.e. body language, respond in a way that would suggest you were anticipating potential problems rather than just reacting to them? So this is what this is about, and I understand it comes with experience. You know, you have to anticipate. As a driver, you should already be pretty reasonably good at anticipating what other drivers might be doing or other road users might do through your experience, and where you can see that something is highly likely going to happen. The first thing you would do is look at your learner to see, do they look like they've recognized what you've recognized? If not, then help them out, make them aware, give them the benefit of your experience on the silly things. Well, I shouldn't say silly things because that's a bit judgmental. I keep pushing this fact that you shouldn't be judgmental. That could happen. So respond in a way that says you were excited, you were anticipating potential problems rather than just reacting to them. So this is what you're trying to do here. You're trying to say, could I anticipate that? Could I anticipated the actions of the pupil as well? And with experience, you will be, because you'll gradually get to appreciate, what people are capable at different levels in their journey of becoming a safe and competent driver. You'll start to recognize that, but it won't happen obviously instantly. Did you inadvertently increase risk as a result of your lack of awareness, or indeed the actions you took or didn't take? If that happens, just put your hands up. Make the student aware that you are a human being, and perhaps you could have done a little bit more to help them in that instance, and there's no harm in doing that. And taking that responsibility on board. So as it says, take responsibility for any action or inaction on your part that did or could have caused a significant risk to arise. So that's what you're looking to do. And again, as I've said, in a perfect world, if you were the most perfect instructor, 100% you'd be doing all that, no doubt about it. Luckily for you, for passing your Part 3 or your standards check, you don't need to be nowhere near 100%. But again, it is one of the core competencies, or if you like, of the test, which you do need to be particularly good at, because being good at this is how you can keep them safe. It doesn't necessarily make you the best teacher or the best coach in the world, but it does enable you to keep the student safe while they're driving around and getting some practice. Because whether your teaching strategies are that good or not, the fact that you can actually enable the student to go around practicing safely will help them to learn, irrespective of how good you are on the teaching and learning side. So this is why this is critical and core. In terms of expressing this now as a skill or as a target for your skills development logbook, you need to be able to develop your ability to continually scan the environment. So that's what we mean by being able to scan the environment for hazards or situations that are likely to be outside the learner's comfort zone, or for which the learner seems unaware or unduly concerned, as exhibited verbally or non-verbally by their language, and have in place either an agreed risk management plan strategy for those hazards or situations which could have reasonably been anticipated, or be ready to intervene verbally or physically for those that could not on a prevention is better than cure basis. Identify new opportunities for further development. So part of this awareness of what's going on is not just to spot faults or risks, it is also to look for opportunities where further developments could be made, to recognize, don't like to use the word, but you could say weaknesses, areas where opportunities for improvement exist, and then help the student become aware of those opportunities and let them decide how they might want to go tackling those opportunities, how they might, and what support, if any, you could provide to help them fill those gaps, or focus on those areas and improve those particular areas. And obviously, in particular, those of a safety critical nature, then as we said, in that case, you need to be more thinking of the old core competencies approach, making sure it happens. You don't have the luxury of carrying on, allowing the thing to be repeated in the hope the pupil will, now you've explained it to them, will actually sort it out. You need to make sure it doesn't really happen again, if at all possible. Be aware of and admit responsibility, as we said before, for anything you may have done that contributed to any safety critical incident. So nobody expects you to be perfect. You're just a human being. if you recognize that it's some way you may have contributed to it, it could have even been because you were saying something or doing something or involved in a conversation with a student that was actually distracting them and partly led to whatever the problem was. You know, just make that clear. You can also use it as a learning point, because you can say, look, even though, you know, I'm an instructor, we were innocently having that discussion. Can you see how that discussion can affect your performance? So you can turn it around as a positive and actually use it to show what can happen, even though you were partly the reason for the situation arising in the first place. So don't be worried about that. You know, the sooner you admit and let people realize that you're a human being and you can make mistakes, the better it will be for you. And the more authentic it will seem to the student that you're being with them and you're treating them as an equal, rather than assuming that you're some sort of God who never makes any mistakes and is perfect in every possible way, which doesn't, to be honest, go down well. And you're certainly not going to get the best from your students if you adopt that type of attitude or approach. You can see from this, even at this stage, even when the students get at a fairly advanced stage and they're driving around and they're doing things right, you can't let yourself relax. You can't start thinking about your summer holidays or whatever else you might be pondering about. You have to keep your eye on the ball. You have to be aware of your surroundings. You have to be prepared to intervene. You have to be prepared to use the dual controls, as we will see in a moment when we look at R4. And ensure any action you take are proportionate to the reality of the situation. So don't go mad with this intervention and support, or don't overestimate the danger that's occurred. You know, otherwise, you know, the student again will think, well, be sensible, surely. You know, why are you talking about the possibility that a plane may have landed on us or something? You know, so just keep anything real, so to speak. So that takes us on to R4 intervention, which is the say it bit of the say it bit. This can be to say it to prevent a safety critical incident from arising. It can be to say it just to generally help the student develop their skills. So intervention can be purely as a means to minimize risk, but it can also be to aid the learning, the teaching, basically. So was verbal or physical intervention by the trainer timely and appropriate? This is still the fault identification, but it's the prevention bit, it's the say it bit. So did you provide an appropriate level of interventional support to deal with any hazard situations outside of the pupil's comfort zone, using Q&A, prompts, partial, full, and physical use of controls, steering, or any other reachable controls, typically in that order if necessary and time permits. So if time permits and you can see you're coming to a situation that you feel is outside of pupil's control, you can start by asking a question if time permits, and your student is at the level that they will not get too distracted by the fact that you're asking a question. If they're at an earlier stage, then you won't be able to use Q&A at this point, and therefore you might just go for a prompt. Sometimes a question is really just a prompt. You might give them partial instruction. You need to ease off a bit here. If the pupil is now petrified because they're heading to this situation, you can see from the look in the face that they've now just gone into complete, almost panic mode. Then you have to drop into full instruction. You know, reassure them, tell them what to do, treat them like the puppet on the string, to make sure that you keep things under control. And if absolutely essential, that may involve using the dual controls, grabbing the steering, switching the indicator off or switching it on, or whatever it happens to be. That's what intervention is about. It's about seeing things early. So again, this shows you why you need to be thinking so far ahead as part of the your R3 skills, R2 and R3 skills. Communicate to the pupil why you needed to intervene as soon as it's possible, as soon as the opportunity arises. But if it's going to take some time, then try to just signpost the situation. I just want you to remember what happened there, or what just took place, or what that person did, or what that person didn't do. Whatever it is, just quickly create a situation where, right, I must remember that. Because if it's going to take you a while before you can discuss it, and you're going to discuss it either as an opportunity for further improvement in their performance, maybe, in which case you probably wouldn't highlight it. You'd probably just keep that to yourself, put it on your clipboard maybe, and then part of your coaching discussion, you would actually find out if they'd recognized where these opportunities for improvement existed for themselves based on how they rated their performance of what they've just been undertaking, which ties into T1, T2, T5, which is feedback to do with the learning, if you like, or performance, rather than risk. L4, whether you're going to adapt the lesson again, and then L1 back to L3, because you've identified potentially some additional learning needs. Or if it's a safety critical driving fault, that needs to be quickly eradicated, which will take us on to R5, which we will be looking at in a moment, and then L4, and then probably L1 through to L3, and then R1 again. So that's the cycle. So that's the difference, if you like. For the first one, you can probably use coaching quite comfortably if you wish to use coaching. If it's the second one, you're more likely to be using something closer to the older core competencies, but remember, in a much more client-centered way. So you can also intervene by communicating to people when things have gone well. Either by using Q&A or by praising them. So who decided that? Well, I did. Well done. You got that perfectly right. So there are ways in which you can perhaps it's a form of intervention, because you're actually interjecting, and sometimes you can do it as a form of reassurance or comfort. This is where, when things are looking tight, so don't worry, I've got your back. Don't you worry. If we need be, I'll step in, but otherwise continue. So there, it may be appropriate to intervene in that way as well, which is, if you like, T5. So that's intervention, say it. So if we now look at what the DVSA are looking for as far as this, which is much more akin to looking at the risk aspect of it, indication of having confidence in this regard could include intervene in a way that actively supports the learning process and safety during the session. So here they're saying not just the safety, but also if it's helping with the learning process, intervention should be, they're happy with that to take place. Allowing the pupil to deal with situations appropriately. Taking control of situation where the pupil is clearly out of their depth. So if you like, this is the almost in disguise, the under instruction bit in a way. If you're not really allowing the pupil to deal with situations appropriately, which they could easily deal with, then that's not doing that. Equally though, if you're taking control of situations, if you're not taking control of situations where the pupil is clearly out of their depth, is also a need perhaps for more instructional input. So it's about this input thing again. Not enough input, too much input. So if we look at what the DVSA have to say about this in terms of lack of competence, ignoring a developing situation, leaving the pupil to flounder, taking control of a situation the pupil is clearly dealing with, constantly intervening when unnecessary, intervening inappropriately and creating distractions, undermining the pupil's confidence. Because the more you take control away from them in this way by telling them what to do all the time, the more you're undermining the student's confidence. So that's not good intervention. And reinforcing the PDI, ADI as the person who is in sole control of the lesson. So if you are a control freak, the problem is you want to dominate this person instead of serving this person, then you may feel like you must order them about and tell them what to do. That's basically what I say, because you want to take sole control of it. And that way, you know, when there is any success, it's your success because you directed it in every little bit. But that's not going to help the learner. The learner has to become self-sufficient and has to start thinking for themselves. So the sooner you start doing that, the better. And if you have a tendency to over-control, then you need to try to resist that and try to think, is this really a benefit for them? Or is this benefiting me? Do I need to feel in control and bossy? Or is that truly helping the student? It may be that if you can't stop being that person, then maybe being a driving instructor isn't the right career for you. So let's have a look at how you would assess your teaching for free or your training license lesson that you've been given using your lesson reflection reform. These are the questions that you would need to ask yourself. Did you intervene when necessary at the learner's direct or indirect, i.e. because of the body language was telling you that you needed to do something, a request for help? But especially when you suspect the developing situation would be outside of the learner's competence zone without your support to help them in some way. Intervene in a way that actively supported the learning process and or safety. In other words, was the intervention welcomed by the learner, and did it truly help the learning process or safety? And did any intervention increase rather than reduce the risk of an incident? And did it overtly increase the feeling of dependency upon you rather than responsibility within the student for themselves? So they're the questions you need to ask. Again, if we turn that around and say, well, how would you express that as an ability that you need as a driving instructor? Then as a target, then we would say, develop your ability to prevent any safety critical incidents arising, or at the very least, minimize the consequences of any such incidents by intervening. So you might not be able to stop them, but you might be able to minimize the consequences of those incidents. Verbally with questions, if time permits, and you can do it. Prompts, again, if time permits, or instructions, you know, and obviously, usually in that order, if you can, do it verbally. If there is the time to do it verbally, there might not be the time, in which case you may jump straight to doing it physically by using the dual controls. If it's taking hold of the steering wheel or applying any other controls within easy reach, you can see why you would have that R1, that risk discussion about not fighting with you when you're grabbing the steering wheel at the very first lesson, which you can see you may need to be useful here. And in an appropriate and timely manner while remaining calm and professional. So you have to remain calm and professional, because often if you're taking this action, you could naturally, your heart might be racing away because you can see the danger, you see the risk, and you need to keep your emotions under control. Otherwise, you might end up shouting at the pupil. You might start getting annoyed with everybody around you. You need to remain calm and professional. And as we said before, if it's a fault of another driver, just imagine that it's a good driver on a bad day. Try to reframe it in your head. The more you get annoyed and emotional about what's happening, the worse your ability will become to assist your learner and keep everybody safe, basically. So that nicely takes us on to the final risk management competency, which is feedback, or SUSIT, as we've said there. This is basically the fault analysis stage of the core competencies that we talked about right at the very beginning, and we identified even in the overview of the part 3 and the standards check in the very first video. Was sufficient feedback given to help the pupil understand any safety? Well, to do that, you've got to understand what happened, what caused it, why it was caused, what the consequences of it could have been. So you start by finding a suitable location or place. I say place because it might be just as a location, because it might be as you're driving along. A place, it might be somewhere where you can stop to review, reflect upon the pupil's recent performance, either on the move, if possible, or stationary. If not, you need to discuss what they can recall, i.e. the student. So start off by saying what they remember of the situation, remembering that you may have signposted it in the first place, as we talked about in the previous under the previous competencies, and if necessary, expand upon what you observed to help them get a fuller picture. So when you listen to them, they may recall some aspects of it, but there may be some aspects of the detail that they didn't take into account, or they wasn't fully aware of. So that's your opportunity now to make them aware of the other factors that may have been in the situation or in the picture, and what had just occurred. But do it without judgment or recourse. So if there are things that other people are doing that are stupid or daft, don't use words like stupid. Anything that's judgmentally orientated, it attaches emotion. Anything that's emotive, any language that's emotive, just attaches emotions to it, and it actually invokes the emotions in the learner driver, and it doesn't serve any purpose in this event to apportion blame, even though the other person or somebody else may have to bear the main responsibility for what took place. You should speak about it in those terms. They should bear most of the responsibility. However, they may have reasons for doing what they did, and so we don't know what those reasons are, so it doesn't help us to call them an idiot or stupid or anything else for that matter. So you're going to complete the picture for them so that they've got a better or a more detailed view of what just took place, what happened. If you think about this, this is a little bit like Gibbs' reflective thing, which is what just happened. And find out what they were thinking or feeling about key aspects of the activity, so you can better understand their reasoning for any actions they took or feelings they may have felt. So before you move on, you need to understand, where the student's coming from, if you like. What were they thinking at that point? What made them make that decision? What did they take into consideration? And why did they act in the way they did? And or what was the feeling that was driving that process? That type of question is what you're trying to ascertain. You're trying to put yourself in their shoes to understand where that student is coming from. You can then use this feedback from them, because you've obtained feedback from them, basically. So you can say that's feedback as well, to introduce other information. And again, you can either use coaching questions or Q&A or simple explanations, to make the student more aware of other things that perhaps they should have taken into account, or other things which perhaps they should have considered as being of a higher priority at this point in time. Whatever it is, this is where the benefit of your vast experience and you understanding how these things can materialize and what can cause them comes into being, basically, or should come into being, assuming that you do know these things, which is why you do need to have a good understanding of the type of driving faults that can occur and what usually is the typical causes of those driving faults, where do they normally come from, what normally happens to cause it in the first place, or what could have been contributing factors. So you do need to understand what these contributing factors could be in an ideal world, so that you can help your student. And it could be that the student comes out with them all by themselves, which is fantastic, because then your job is done. You don't really need to give them any other information. The information, they've concluded it for themselves, and they've worked it all out for themselves, and they realize what they will do differently next time, which would be fantastic. You know, and with that, they can then better rate their performance. You know, because there's no point in asking them, you know, based on what just happened, how would you rate yourself 1 to 10? You know, that wouldn't be the point at which you would do it. You'd do it at this point once you've raised awareness of the situation, and you've perhaps given them the benefit of the other factors that they might have taken into account. That would be the time when you would ask them. But in fact, you might not need to ask them, because they've already identified where it is that they need to work on for themselves, which is, again, fantastic. You don't need to point those things out to them. However, there's probably something that they need to do differently next time. And so as you move into the remedial action stage, which is in fact adapting the lesson L4, L1 to L3 and R1, the sorting option, that's where you will explore a plan man to deal with whatever it is that you've discovered from your reflection or review. And that's the point where we're at here. This is more to do with just dealing with a safety critical incident. Obviously, if you're looking, which you would be looking at the same time, not just at safety critical issues, but you'd be talking about, if you like, any areas of performance that you need to work on, then that's where you're also dealing with, if I'm right, I think is it T5 as well? It might be T5. Not absolutely certain on that. So if we look at the DVSAs, safety critical feedback, guide to examiners, indications of competence would be finding a safe place to stop and examine the critical incident. Unless you could deal with it on the move, of course. Allowing the pupil time to express any fears or concerns the incident might have caused. So obviously, if there was a serious incident, there's no point in having an immediate discussion until students calm down and relaxed and breathe, because they may be in a heightened sense of emotional stress as a consequence of what may just have happened. So the first thing is to get them calm and feel comfortable. Supporting the pupil to reflect clearly, this is where the reflection and the review comes in, about what happened. Providing input to clarify aspects of it and that not understand. Well, if you're coaching, you're going to try to get the student to figure those things out for themselves. If you're not particularly coaching orientated, you are going to explain to them other things that they need to be aware of to actually draw a better conclusion from what's just occurred. Support the pupil to identify strategies for future situations, you know, how we're going to deal with it going forward. If it's a safety critical thing, then no doubt it's going to involve you in providing some level of support, just to make sure the situation doesn't arrive again, even if that is simply just a question, because you're now going to make sure that you're going to put the student into a similar situation where the same driving fault could occur. But this time you might ask a question before you get to the point where the fault did occur, to see whether or not it's likely that they're going to repeat that fault. And if the way the student responds gives you the impression that actually they're not going to repeat that fault, then fine, you would probably let it continue on. If, however, they didn't respond in a way that you would expect, then you might use other levels of intervention. So you go straight from Q&A, maybe a prompt, maybe even full instruction. Who knows, maybe even dual controls to make sure that the situation doesn't reoccur. Providing input when the pupil does not understand what they should do differently. So there's no point you giving any feedback input if the student doesn't understand what you're saying, or what do you want me to do differently this time from what I did last time. You haven't really made it clear what is it that needs to change exactly, and how can we make sure that change happens. Checking that the pupil feels able to put the strategy in place, so how do you feel about that? Making sure that if you have a plan, which is really more to do, I suppose, with adaptive lesson help, or but making sure that they feel comfortable in putting this strategy going forward into place, and agree ways of developing that competence if the pupil feels the need. So again, it's part of the plan, man. It's part of the adapting the lesson, the L1 to the L3, the L4, and ultimately then the sharing of responsibility, the R1. So although it's listed here, it actually would partly be marked on the feedback if you were doing that very well. It'll also affect your adapting your lesson. It'll affect your goals and your needs, and it'll affect all the other things as well. As you can see how they're so closely and tightly interconnected. So looking at the guidance of bad practice, indications of lack of competencies regard winning or failing to examine the incident, i.e. completely ignoring it, I guess that's what that means. Taking too long to address the issue generated by an incident. In other words, you drive, for another 5 minutes, and then by the time you actually raise the issue, the student can't even remember what day it is, let alone what happened 5 minutes ago. So, taking too long, not allowing the pupil to explore their own understanding. This is where you say, well, I'll tell you what you did wrong. This is what you did wrong. This is where you need to do it. And do you realize what danger that could have caused if it hadn't been for me doing this, that, or the other? That's not client-centered. That would have been fine for the old Part 3 test many, many years ago, but that won't be good enough now. They will want, because you can understand why it's not good enough, because that won't necessarily change behavior in the student. Yes, they'll go along with it because they want to pass the test and they want to do as they're told. They don't want to upset the driving instructor. But that's not the point. The point is to get the student to recognize it for themselves so that it becomes part of their normal driving beyond having passed the test. In other words, you're trying to influence their attitudes and their values deep-seated within them as part of this learning process. Now, obviously, that's a bit deep. You don't particularly need to be brilliant at doing that for passing your Part 3 or Part or your standards check. But going forward, if you want to be the best, then that's what you need to be thinking about. Telling the pupil what the solution is and not checking their understanding. Well, that's just carrying on from what I just said, basically. Failing to check the pupil's ability to put into place the agreed strategy. In other words, you're not checking if it's an agreed strategy at all because you're not asking them. And when you ask them, it's no good them just saying, yeah, I think so. Because if they said, yeah, I think so, then the body language is quite telling you that they're not on board. Make sure you've got what we sometimes say as the buy-in before you actually, start with your next plan or your next chunk of learning. So it states also in the guidance, if a safety critical or potentially critical incident does occur, it is vital that the pupil fully understands what happened and how they could have avoided or dealt with it better. Ideally, the pupil should be supported to analyze the situation for themselves. So that's the big difference. That's the client-centered bit for themselves. However, it may be necessary for the PDI ADI to provide feedback if, for example, the pupil simply does not see a problem, in which case it's more of a selling job than it is than a coaching job. That feedback should be given as soon as is practical after the incident has occurred, simply because you won't remember, or they won't remember what occurred, and they may have forgotten about it. Depends obviously how big an incident it was. If it was an incident that scared them after death, then the chances are they won't have forgotten about it. You see what I mean? So that's bad practice. Oops, it looks like I've got these bullet points out of order, but nevertheless, they'll all come up in good course. So when it comes to assessing your performance in your lesson reflection form, in your student's logbook, when you're assessing your own lessons when you're providing either teach for free or you're on a training license, did you obtain feedback as well as give feedback to ensure the learner was happy and committed to any new plan agreed, which is the L4 bit. And there's the other ones. Find a suitable place. Did you find a suitable place to discuss what had just happened as soon as it was practical to do so? Or look to deal with it on the move using a quiet road with few distractions. So you may be able to, which is another reason why the student needs to be at least at the train stage, is so that there is a possibility that you could have a discussion or a dialogue while on the move with the student, if possible. Encourage and support the learner to reflect on what had just happened and how it made them feel, which is thinking and the feeling bit we talked about. Help the learner to evaluate it and consider how they might better deal with it or avoid it in future, and or change the lesson plan in light of it if necessary. If the safety critical incident occurred because the student was actually in the wrong practice area, or the challenge was ridiculously too great for the student, either because they were having an off day for some reason, or it's simply a bad plan, or you hadn't anticipated the change in the circumstances in this particular area, then it's not about what the pupil needs to do next so much as what you need to do next in terms of changing the plan, so the student isn't put in that situation again on this lesson when quite clearly it's way beyond what they're ready to cope with at this stage in their development. So if it's beyond what they cope with this area, you don't keep going around it and try to make this gigantic leap to be able to deal with it. You actually recognize that they shouldn't have been put in that situation in the first place. And so you're going to change the plan to address that. And it could be that you didn't realize it's a market day today, and as a consequence, there's much more traffic and other things that you didn't realize. Although, again, that potentially shows bad planning, because remember, from the overview, it's up to you as the pupil. Sorry, it's up to you as the PDI or the ADI to make sure you know the test area where you're going to actually be delivering this particular lesson. Did you clarify the learner's findings? In other words, so what you've said to me is this, and this. Any new goals identified? If there is a new goal that between you've decided to focus your attention on, it could be that either you've suspended the current goal, replaced it with this new goal, as the case may be, or action plan. So it may be the same goal, but you're actually going to focus on a particular element of being able to achieve that goal, i.e. learning, that's more specific learning need. And thus you're changing the action plan with that in mind before proceeding with the lesson, which is part of the adapting L4. Did you obtain feedback as well as giving feedback? Which is what I said right at the beginning of this session about what's involved. Whenever you think about feedback, think, well, can I get feedback as well from them? Because it's usually a two-way street. To ensure the pupil, sometimes called 360 feedback, by the way, to ensure the pupil was happy and committed to any new action plan agreed, L4, which is what unfortunately came up as the first bullet point. I'll correct the slides later, the next time anybody gives this particular presentation. So, if we look at that from the point of view of if you look at that from the point of view of developing your skill as a target, this is the way you might express it: to develop your ability to deal with any potential or actual safety critical incidents by either finding a suitable place to stop, should it be absolutely necessary, or where possible, deal with it on the move, ensuring that suitable feedback is provided in a calm manner to help the learner A, recover and calm down if necessary, B, recognize you have intervened or identified one or more issues that potentially need to be dealt with, if not obvious to them, in a timely manner so that they may recall the incident subsequently. Determine what they thought or felt about the need for you to intervene or the issues that had arose. So it's not about your intervention or what actually happened, with a view to establishing what caused them, again, without blame, and what's the contributing factors here. Because this is developing their ability to measure and understand risk and why driving it is in fact a risky business. Having first engaged them to consider this for themselves, again, remember we're client-centered, so which in fact is what T2 is about, and which we'll be discussing in the next video, and establish the risk of or dangers of having first encountered, establish the risk or dangers having first encouraged them to consider what they might have been or indeed were, to see if this should now be dealt with as a priority. So depending on that, your objective for the lesson may be A, but because of this particular situation that's arose, you've decided that that's perhaps a more important priority to deal with. So you're going to park the current goal, we're going to focus on this, and once we've got this dealt with, then if time permits, we're going to go back to the original plan or goal, as the case may be. Establish what they need to know, understand, or do differently. This is obviously like part of the coaching conversation. Going forward, with a view to adapting the agreed lesson plan in some way, the sorted bit. So that really covers the 5 competencies that are associated with risk management. So that brings us back to our original diagram. So as you can see, hopefully you can now see the close connection between the lesson planning and the risk management, and in fact how they closely, the levels of instruction, the intervention, which is just another form of level of instruction, how that actually ties in as part of your teaching and or learning strategies as well. But we are going to focus on these in the next video. Just brought up the old core competencies again, so you can see how these all still exist very strongly, particularly in this area and in this area. And as you'll see, they also appear during the teaching and learning strategies, which we will be looking at next. So that is all I wanted to cover on the risk management side. I hope you've found that useful and interesting. I'm sorry if I've gone into quite a bit of detail, but there is a lot to understand. But do bear in mind, while these particular competencies in risk management do have to be done pretty well, the way we've described them here is quite exceptional. So, I mean, if you could get anywhere close to the targets that we set as part of this presentation, then you should have no problems at all really passing either your part 3 or your standards check. If you're going to be good at anything, these are the 5 competencies that you particularly need to focus your attention on. So I will say now goodbye, and I hope you will watch me in the final 4th video, which is looking at teaching and learning strategies. So bye for now.